Russia consolidated itself as an absolutist monarchic state in the end of the 16th century under the rule of Ivan IV, known as the Terrible, who adopted the title of Tsar. He studied the country's territorial expansion, which extended until the end of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian economy remained predominantly based on rural activities. 85% of the country's total population was made up of poor peasants, and most of them lived under feudal servitude. The abolition of feudalism in 1861 did not contribute to improving the situation of the population, who continued to live under the rule of large rural landowners. The industrialization process in Russia began in the late 19th century. At that time, while England and other European countries already had industrial parks, in the middle of the Second Industrial Revolution, Russia had few manufacturing centers. The workers worked in unhealthy environments with extremely low wages and faced journeys of up to 14 hours a day. Russian industrialization focused on 3 points: St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Don River region. At the beginning of the 20th century, still as a predominantly peasant country with some points of high industrial concentration, the political system of Russia was archaic, and the government showed no interest in the elaboration of political and social reforms. However, even with the repression and authoritarianism, there were clandestine groups opposing the government, advocates of structural changes that favor the entire population. With industrial growth, Russian cities developed considerably. Between 1860 and 1914, the urban population increased from 6 million to almost 19 million people. Living and working in appalling conditions, workers began to organize themselves into associations. In 1898, intellectuals and members of the working class formed the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, an underground group with a Marxist orientation. In 1903, the group had two ideological tendencies. One of them was that of the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin. This division proposed the formation of a worker-peasant alliance whose answer was to implement socialism through a workers' revolution. The other trend was that of the Mensheviks. More moderate than the Bolsheviks, they argued that it was necessary to support the bourgeoisie through a democratic revolution. Only after that would the working class be able to organize itself to carry out a socialist reform. In January 1905, during the Russo-Japanese War, Russia's internal problems were aggravated by the lack of food required for the troops. Approximately 200,000 people performed a peaceful demonstration in St. Petersburg, the Russian capital, whose demand was the implementation of a constituent assembly and better living and work conditions. Government forces fired into the crowd, killing about 1,000 people. It was known as Bloody Sunday. This massacre reverberated throughout Russia. In big cities, Soviets were created. They were councils formed by representatives of the workers who decided on the political maneuvers of the struggle against Tsarism. The most important Soviet was in the capital, presided over by Lev Davidovich Bronstein, known as Leon Trotsky. The Soviets organized strikes, looting, and demonstrations, which broke out all over. In the Black Sea, the sailors of the battleship Potemkin rose up. In October, a general strike paralyzed the country. Cornered by the movement, Tsar Nicholas II legalized political parties and granted legislative powers to the Duma, which was a kind of parliament. However, at the time, he severely repressed the Soviets and the strike movement. Trotsky and other leaders were arrested. The revolution of 1905 did not overthrow the Tsarist government, but turned Russia into a constitutional monarchy. However, the government of Nicholas II maintained authoritarian characteristics. The police continued to exercise the role of a censorship institution for civil liberties, and the Tsar had the power to dissolve the Duma at any time. On February 27, 1917, the population of Petrograd and other cities revolted. The Tsar was forced to abdicate and a provisional government elected by the Duma was established. At the same time, workers, peasants, soldiers, and sailors organized into Soviets across the country. The new rulers of Menshevik orientation abolished the press, censorship, legalized parties, freed political prisoners, and allowed exiles to return to the country. The Tsar and his family were arrested. Even so, Russia remained involved in the First War, and the main demand of the peasants, workers, and soldiers of low patent have not been met. These social groups realized that little had changed in the living conditions after the February Revolution, and popular dissatisfaction grew progressively. Lenin led violent protests against the provisional government, proclaiming the slogans "Peace, Bread and Land, and all power to the Soviets." Trotsky joined the Bolshevik Party and was elected president of the Petrograd Soviet. The Bolsheviks quickly won the support of the leadership of most of the Soviets and in October 1917 overthrew the provisional government. After the October Revolution, the new government, led by Lenin, nationalized factories, railways, and banks and confiscated church property. Large properties were expropriated and distributed to the peasants. With regard to foreign policy, Russians and Germans signed a peace treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and the Russians came out of World War I. As early as 1918, however, the country was plunged into a bloody civil war which pitted the Red Army, organized and commanded by Trotsky, and the White Army, mobilized by the former ruling classes and reinforced by troops sent by England, United States, Canada, Japan, and France, whose governments feared the spread of Russian communism in the world. The Civil War would only end in February 1921 with the victory of the Bolsheviks, led by Trotsky. With the end of the internal conflict, Lenin's government adopted a plan to recover the country, which combined communist principles with capitalist measures. The government adopted measures to centralize power around the Bolshevik Party, now called the Communist Party. A strict discipline was implemented in the factories, the press became controlled, political parties were outlawed, and freedom of speech was restricted. The Soviets ceased to be a space for democratic discussion and became executors of party orders. Many opponents of the new regime were arrested. Tsar Nicholas II and his family were executed. In 1922, the new country was renamed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Lenin suffered a heart attack and withdrew little by little from power until his death in 1924. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, Joseph Stalin, began to dispute with Leon Trotsky the leadership of the Soviet Union. Winner of the internal dispute with Trotsky, Stalin had at his service the state bureaucracy and of the party. One of his measures was to eliminate all opponents. They were arrested or executed. Trotsky, for example, was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929 and forced into exile in Mexico, where he died in 1940, assassinated on Stalin's orders. Under the new government, the Soviet Union isolated itself from the world and transformed itself into a world power. Industrialization was given great impetus through 5-year plans. However, the formation of an egalitarian society, one of the ideals of the early socialists, was forgotten. In place of socialism, a bureaucratic society emerged, controlled mainly by an elite of civil servants, while the majority of population lived in precarious conditions and saw themselves excluded from participation and political decisions. At the top of the society was the Communist Party, which fully controlled all the organs of the state. The head of that party, Stalin, was considered infallible, and its opponents were harshly repressed.